also welcome Pina Leyland, who is a social worker with COASIT, who is also my right-hand lady. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Pina to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So many of you would know that COASIT was established in 1968. It was set up to help promote Italian language and culture in New South Wales, and also to assist the recently arrived to settle. So COASIT has three main areas of service. Language services, so they have language classes for adults and children, a whole range of language services, story time for kids, professional development for teachers, accreditation for learning of language in association with Università per gli Stranieri in Perugia. Then a lot of what we do is aged care, and the first point of contact is the community liaison officer, who takes all the initial phone inquiries and the drop-ins, people who drop into the office. She deals with all the referrals to my aged care. And anyone who works in aged care or has anything to do with aged care service would know what my aged care is. It's the first point of contact for all government-funded services. You have to go, it's like a funnel. You have to go through my aged care in order to be assessed and be referred and have access to services. So once upon a time, COASIT social workers would go out and assess people and make referrals. Now we're mainly involved in linking people in, helping them to negotiate their way through the system. We no longer can do assessments and referrals. It all happens through my aged care. So with the social work role, that's the next point of contact after the intake, or the community liaison officer, which used to be called the intake officer. So my colleague Vincenzo Cositore and I, we are very busy visiting people at home. We cover all of metropolitan Sydney, and COASIT's just branched out recently to Wollongong, the Wollongong area, and Gosford. So it's a challenge to go a bit beyond the normal scope of things. So we follow up all the phone inquiries. We also have a lot to do with my aged care, following up referrals, making sure people get services. We also attend regional forums to represent COASIT, and not just COASIT and Italians, but it's a voice in the CALD sector. So CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse, used to be called NESB, non-English speaking backgrounds. Before that it was called ethnic, and before that migrant. Actually, I find that while I'm going out talking about boring stuff like my aged care and explaining all the jargon and all the acronyms, that really the most value in what I do is that interpersonal connection, letting people tell their story a little bit, giving them a little bit of energy and care, really. And they tend to value that and appreciate it. So next big area of work that COASIT has been involved with for about 30 years is called the Community Visitors Scheme. Social support groups, they're also a huge area of work. So COASIT's funded to run 17, the other catchphrase for these groups is centre-based daycare. So these are groups where a little bus will go to the person's home, pick them up, take them to a centre, community centre. They'll have morning tea, then they'll have usually proper coffee. They like proper coffee, not instant coffee. And they'll have some activities. They can play tombola. The ladies like to play tombola. The men often like to play cards. Gentle exercise program, and information sessions. We'll go along and give them information about different things, and they sometimes appreciate that. Sometimes it just gets in the way of their tombola and they're not too happy. But anyway, so there's about 230 people that attend those 17 groups across Sydney. 2 of them are multicultural groups, so they're delivered in partnership with some other organisations, and 3 of them are dementia-specific groups, so they're tailored specifically for people who have memory loss and need a bit more support. There are also 2 active ageing groups, And they're for the younger, fitter people who like to get out and about and don't want to sit in the centre and play cards or tombola. They like to do things that are active. So one of those groups, Coesit funds, and it fundraises through the National Ball each year. Each year there's a different theme. This year they were fundraising for one of those groups. So that's one of our one of our volunteer coordinators, that's Claudia at the forum. This one's one of our volunteers with a client at her home. This is one of the social support groups, and I think the next one as well. They're doing a bit of gentle exercise, and that's our lovely social support assessments officer, Jacqueline, with a couple of people at one of the Seniors Week events. So COASIT every March, with funding from state government, organises some events for Seniors Week, and we bring everyone together for those, all sorts of different groups, so the social support groups, the daycare clients and the other clients come in for those. Alright, so now I need to talk about the Homecare Packages, which is the big bulk of aged care services. There are two kinds of services. There are some low level, so they're individual, they're either just domestic assistance or just transport or just help with the gardening. And they're not coordinated, they're individual. COASIT isn't funded to do those. COASIT's only funded to do these home care packages. And it's for people that need more than one thing, more complex needs. So we coordinate a variety of services. There are 4 levels of service. They're across Sydney and, as I said, Wollongong and Gosford. And the person receiving the services must be assessed through My Aged Care. And it's, they move on to different things, or they get a bit tired because it's hard work, or anyway, it's a bit of a revolving door, but we're constantly recruiting people. So if you know of anyone who might like to work as a care worker, they get trained, they get COASIT pays for Certificate 3 course that they do as part of their work. So it's a good stepping stone for a lot of people to, move out from being at home with kids to back in the workforce or moving on to do other kinds of work. So that's a little plug if anyone knows anyone. Ring COASIT, thank you. We also have a private service, it's called Home Help, and that was set up because someone came to us in dire need. My mum's just coming out of hospital, she needs help at home. I don't care, I haven't got time to go through all the processes, I need it tomorrow or now. I don't care how much I have to pay, just give me the service. So on the basis of that, some years ago, that's where the private service got set up. And that's a very busy program. And we also supply through that program to other organisations. So we have a partnership with about 20 other organisations like Uniting Care and Baptist Care, that kind of thing. And where they have an Italian client or client of Italian background who needs a bilingual worker, they will come to us and our workers get brokered to them. And sitting in the community services space, it's interesting because often there's all this bargaining that goes on between, no, I need that care worker for this client, and so there's all this negotiating goes on. So we've got 17 special funded groups that meet in centres and the 2 active ageing ones. But we also, under the COASIT umbrella, there are 18 other groups that meet across Sydney that are independent, but they need help with paying insurance and applying for grants and acquitting grants and doing that kind of boring stuff. So we do that for them and they trundle along and organise themselves. We help with activities of daily living. These are the home care packages. We help with activities of daily living, which means if someone needs help with showering or meal preparation or dressing or making the bed, that kind of stuff. Transport, socialisation, in-home respite, allied health, which is physiotherapy or occupational therapy, and equipment. So it can include a whole range of different things. It depends on the individuals and it depends, it's negotiated. at the time of signing them up and continually negotiate what people need and how the service is delivered. So this is one of our coordinators, Francesca. This is again the active ageing group. They like to go out in parks, and some of them are very fit, even fitter than me. I don't think I could do that. We also have a counselling team. So these do see people that are aged 65 or over, but they also see people aged from 18 up. So we have a couple of women who work as mental health counsellors. They are psychologists, and actually they're all psychologists. They're just called different things. We have a drug and alcohol project officer who's a psychologist, and a gambling help. So the Italian community, they like to gamble. Sometimes they get into trouble. So the government, with its money from all the poker machines, gives us money to run this program, and for those in need, strategies to try and contain the interest in gambling or manage it. All right, this is a group that's enjoying an event. They're again the active ageing group, lovely and colourful. And this is one of the Seniors Week events where, as I said before, it brings together people from all the different programs that we run. All right, so contacts. So you can ring if anyone knows of anyone who needs assistance, or if you need any more information. The first point of contact is Fiorenza. There are 2 Facebook pages. One is the generic COASIT Facebook page, and the other one is the Welcome to Australia page. So as well as the psychologists, we have a youth and family program, and there's a new wave of people coming from Italy. With all the economic crisis in Europe, things are grim. We've got very highly educated, very talented people coming to the country now, thousands of them, in droves. So some of them get into a bit of trouble and need information and advice, and that's why there's this youth and family, another project officer, and also the Welcome to Australia program. So they do things like help people write CVs, apply for jobs, give them information about accommodation, stuff to do with visas, all that kind of stuff, all the settlement stuff that we used to do right at the beginning. So it's like a second cycle. The Welcome to Australia program, they also do events called aperitivo around the place, and the idea is to bring people together, so isolated people who are struggling with their settlement, or not even struggling, just liking to connect with people, bring them together, and also to interact with the homegrown people like me. So we've got new terms coming into play. I heard a new term at a conference recently. I'd never heard it before. It's FOBs. Has anyone heard what FOBs are? I hadn't either. Fresh off the boat. So FOBs and homegrowns. So here we are, interacting together. So thank you for listening. If you want to ask questions, I'll be around later. Thank you.
Thank you, Pina. I think we've probably all been through some of this. I certainly did with my parents. So it's a reality that we've all got to get ready for and get used to. But thankfully, we've got COASIT. One of the things that impresses me with COASIT is that I've been involved with this organisation now for about 12 years, but I never really thought that it was any bigger than sort of what it is here. But when you go into COASIT's office and see the people that are working there, and we've got several hundred, people just don't seem to understand that we've got that many people there doing all sorts of work. So if anyone has time on their hands, please put your hand up. Thanks again, Pina. I'd now like to call Loretta, and she's the big minister.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Italian Forum Cultural Centre and COASIT, and especially to Pina for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. And thank you all for coming out. You said I'm the big item, but I think these issues are really so central and so important, and the work that COASIT does clearly very highly regarded in the community broadly, I know. And I have been, so I work at the University of Western Australia in the discipline group of Anthropology and Sociology, and I've been researching Italian migration for about 30 years now. I've done work on second generation, growing up Italian in Australia. Most of my work has been on transnational families. But I was asked to talk a bit about my own family history, and also I decided I'd talk about my most recent research project. So I'm sharing with you research in progress, ideas that aren't really necessarily fully formed, but ideas that I'm working on at the moment. And that project is actually about ageing. So I've called this talk Staying in Touch Across Distance, 100 Years of Italian-Australian Migration, because I'm interested in how connections to Italy, connections to homeland, the relationship between the migrant communities and the homeland have developed over time. They've always been there, and what they've looked like and how they've been different in the past to what they are now. And that's a really good introduction to my own family history. And my family history, especially on my mother's side, spans the full century or more of Italian migration history. And my initial inspiration in particular was the life story of my great-grandmother. Her husband, my great-grandfather, migrated to the southwest of Western Australia, so 5 hours southwest of Perth in the country, a place called Pemberton, Manjimup, the forest country, the tall carry tree country. So my great-grandfather migrated to the southwest in 1925. He left a small mountain town on the Swiss-Italian border called Barofini. This is actually not a picture of Barofini, but it's similar. They practiced transhumance, they had 3 residences up the mountain and they would follow the sun up the mountain over the course of the seasons. And this is actually their top residence, right on the border with Switzerland. When he left in 1925, he left his wife, my great-grandmother, with 2 children and 1 on the way. So this photograph was taken a couple of years after he left, because the 3rd baby is born. And the surly-looking girl is my grandma. I love that photo of her. It took them 12 years to be reunited in the port of Fremantle. So the little girl here, my great-aunt, didn't see her dad until she was 14. That's how long it took to raise the money to bring them over. And that kind of separation was not uncommon. In fact, I've met a few people in the audience who have exactly the same family history. The women in these stories were called le vedove bianche, the white widows. White because they didn't have to wear black, their men were still alive, but they were like social widows. So they were called the white widows. And I became fascinated with how you maintain a family across distance like that, across that kind of lengthy separation. And that sowed the seed when I heard this story. And that story continues, and it was my great-grandmother who really captured my imagination, because 2 short years after they were reunited and in Fremantle and they went down to Pemberton, they were really pioneers. They were Australian pioneers despite being Italian migrants. They were clearing the land and setting up the farms. 2 short years after they were reunited, the war broke out. And my great-grandfather, despite being naturalised, at the time they were called naturalised British subjects, was interned for the duration of the war, and they sent him to South Australia to Loveday Camp, so they couldn't even visit. So my great-grandmother was left alone in this foreign land with 3 teenagers, hardly spoke a word of English. And interestingly, my great-grandfather was interned because I investigated this. Why was he interned? He was here already 14 years. He was a big man in the community. And that's actually why he was interned. He was a big man in the community. A lot of people depended on him. So the Australian government, under the philosophies and views of wartime, thought that he could be a fifth columnist. He could rally support in the community for Mussolini. Certainly wasn't what he was doing, but that was the reason. And he was a very good English speaker by then. So he was used in the camps and kept for the duration because of his skill as an interpreter. So, but back to my great-grandmother. The story goes that in the mountain village, what you did for entertainment was sing. And she was a great singer, and she spent her time singing, her free time singing. But after he was interned, she never sang again. And she never really settled in Australia. I remember her as a very elderly woman. She never really settled in Australia. She was used to the small communal life of the village and the very active social life of the village, and she moved to this very foreign place, to this very dispersed community. She was used to the mountains. She was used to the mountains, not the forest. And she suffered great hardship being a vedova bianca. When her husband became naturalised or a British subject, she too became a British subject. And the children became British subjects because that's the way citizenship law worked. And as a result of that, the children couldn't go to the local schools on scholarships because they were Italian government scholarships and they were no longer citizens of Italy. I think my great-grandparents' story, and they weren't the first to arrive, it was my trisnonnu, my great-great-grandfather who came out from the Valtellina in the early years of the last century. Then he went back and his son came out. They really represent the traditional migration model, which was often thought of as a three-stage model. The single man left, he arrived on his own, he established his job and his home, and that could often take 12 or 14 or 16 years. Then he called out his family. And migration really had a kind of set of images about departure, settlement, acculturation. There was this idea back then that you became a new Australian and you shed your culture. And it was a one-line, straight-line thesis of identity. Was really this idea of rupture and breaking. We don't think about migration like that anymore, and that's for a couple of reasons. We've had a major transformation in social communication technologies, information communication technologies. We can now stay in touch across distance in a way that was never even imagined before, through things like Skype and email and SMS and WhatsApp and Viber and mobile phones. But also we can afford to travel more. The affordability of travel has radically changed. So today we talk about, rather than migration as a one-way process that ends with settlement, we talk about transnational migration, and this has changed our theories and the way we think about migration. We think more about migration as a continuous connection between places, the home and host country. And certainly this new idea about migration is making us revisit the earlier model and say, well, actually, those families did stay in touch. My great-grandparents' family stayed in touch despite being separated for 12 years. The other thing that we do a lot to stay connected between places across distance is imagine. We imagine co-presence. And distance is socially constructed. We create those distances, and sometimes Italy feels a long way away and sometimes it feels very close, and I'm sure you have similar experiences. So my first book was about the visit because, and this was published in 2001, which was really the beginning of the revolution when we could afford to travel, well, certainly before Skype, but it was the beginning of those social fields feeling closer together. And I was arguing in this book that the visit home should be seen as one of the stages in the migration process, that, you know, the people migrated and then they were reunited and then they visited home. And in fact, this is 9 families, and these dots represent their visits home. And you can see in the 50s and 60s, they weren't very regular. People couldn't afford them. The only real reason to go back home was to find a wife. And if you couldn't afford to, you had proxy marriages. That was one way to have a social field connected across distance. You had the proxy marriage. But see, in the 70s and 80s, when people could start affording the travel with time and money, people are going back in this group as often as they can afford to, sometimes every year. And I think that's a very common experience today as well. So we've been in Australia a long time, the Italian community, and we can talk about different waves. And I won't dwell on this slide except to say that I thought that my research on Italians was coming to an end in the late 1990s, and then we had this amazing new migration with numbers greater than the post-war period, which I did not believe until I saw the statistics. And there are some members of that new wave in the audience tonight, and it's really interesting to hear Pina talk about the homegrown and the FOBs and how the aperitivo are bringing them together. These people experience enormous precarity and vulnerability, different to my great-grandparents or even my father. My father migrated in the post-war period in 1956 as a young man from the Veneto. Baldassar is his name, from the Veneto. I've done lots of research, as I said, and I want the second part of my talk to be about staying in touch across distance over these different 100 years. I just want to share with you one particular study tonight, which is transnational caring, how people care across distance. And I was particularly interested in the way migrants manage to care for their ageing parents from a distance, because if there is a care chain in Australia, it's that kind of care chain. It's adult migrants living in Australia caring for their ageing relatives back home, rather than small children, which was the experience of the early pre-war people like my great-grandparents. And I want to share with you something that an elderly Irish woman in the study said to me. She said, when my great-uncle left Ireland, she was already elderly, she called herself an Irish grandma. She said, when my great-uncle left for Australia, we held a wake for him in the local pub. A wake is an Irish funeral rite. It's like a party, really, where you celebrate the life of the deceased. But the uncle was there. And this represents the way migration was seen as a kind of social death. They weren't sure if they'd ever see this uncle again. He was going off into the unknown, and there were very few ways of staying in touch. And then she said, in contrast, when my nephew migrated a few years ago on a working holiday visa, his departure inspired the purchase of a new computer. So, from a type of social death to the purchase of a new computer. And this quote represents the radical difference now in the way social fields are maintained, in the emotional geographies, if you like, of our connections between places. So I want to spend a bit more time comparing these two experiences of distance by sharing with you some of my research findings. Interestingly, in my father's hometown in Tarzo, near Conegliano, Treviso, there's a monument to the migration which was so common in those parts of Italy that sent migrants abroad, all the parts of Italy that sent migrants abroad, and Veneto was one of them. And they have a monument to the reunion. This monument is called L'Incontro. But here's some quotes from some of the people I interviewed, remembering the early years. So Piero was born in 1924. He was left behind. It took him a long time to be reunited with his father who migrated. And he said the story he always remembers his father telling after they were reunited, after being separated for a decade, was that for years the only money he spent was on stamps to write to Mum and myself. He said it cost him £1.80. I'll always remember that amount. And he had trouble sometimes raising the money to buy the stamp to send the letters home, because the main way people stayed connected was through letters. This is a lovely story from Jackie Templeton's Book of Letters from the Valtellina, a fantastic collection of letters that she found and published. Dino coped with loneliness during his 8-year stint as a timber worker in WA by invoking his wife's image, imagining her image and that of his small child. Her letters helped him sustain an illusion that they were really all still together and helped him imagine he was still sharing their family life. So he writes home to his wife in a letter. He says, "I think of him, Silvio, and I see him in every moment of the day, just as if I were with you, trying to forget how far away I am, and that at the end of the day and after my hard work, I can't have him before me, everything that made me happy, listening to him, seeing him, playing with him, and instead for now I have to content myself with thinking of him and imagining he's in front of me and mischievous, just as he always was, and I escape into my thoughts and am happy." Again, imagined co-presence, wanting to see but not being able to. A lot of the letters had some key themes. Frustration at not being kept properly informed. So one man writes, "I want to know how much there still is in the bank and what the countryside looks like, and tell my son Vincenzo to write proper letters and let me know all the family news, and you don't tell me enough, and even if you don't get a letter from me, write all the same what you need and what's happening." That was a common theme in these letters. Torment at not being appreciated or understood. After 8 years in the bush, Franco wrote, "I got the letter from our mother in which she tells me that you're all well. This was a great comfort for me, and the rest of the letter was a great torment, as she told me to come home so that we could all be poor together. Things seem to be very bad, but I don't believe you are suffering from lack of food and drink, and as for having to work too hard or being a bit short of money, that I can believe a bit. And because of the war, and it's the same here in Australia, and I'm sending you 10 lira because the job has come to an end and I can't do without everything." The last example is actually written by my grandfather, the man who married that surly little girl in the picture. And he says, "You say you are displeased to hear that I waste my money on beer and amusements, but what do you expect? I can't find myself a suitable girl." The local girls were warned off, the Italian men, and there were letters written to the government to increase the number of women coming from Italy so that the men would not be interested in the Australian girls. "So it's better to enjoy yourself while you are young, and last Friday was my birthday, and my hand is still shaking because of all the booze I drunk myself blind on for 7 days, partly as a consolation for maybe having found a bit of land, which is the property, which might even hold my fortune, and partly for my 25th birthday." That was an insight into my grandfather that I didn't expect. Hopefully he was exaggerating. That was a letter to his sister, not his mum. Now, a lot of people when I talk about staying in touch across distance are very sceptical about how you can do this well, especially if they're not themselves in transnational families. So I want to give you a little glimpse of a couple who were promessi sposi, they were fiancés. This couple, Antonietta Petris and her fiancé Loris Palmer, were separated for exactly 1 year between 1948 and 1949. He was in Venice and she had to go to Canada with her parents. And in this 1 year period, 450 letters they wrote. And here's some examples of them. Last example from this period, we're heading a bit closer to now, we're heading to the immediate post-war period, is from Federica, who would have loved to have received 450 letters a year, and she was prepared to write that many. But like many others, she didn't get them, and she suffered terribly. "I felt that, well, I might as well be dead for them because, you know, I'm so far away." And she didn't get enough letters, and this threw her into great depressions. And she talks about the sense of isolation and how that was exacerbated by contact being mainly through the letter and very infrequent phone calls. And phone calls that were terribly frustrating because you spent your time worrying about how much they cost rather than on what you were saying and what you were hearing. So, you know, she too also complained about how they kept secrets from her. They didn't tell her what was happening to protect her. So if someone died, they might not tell her, and she'd find these things out on a visit home, and she felt betrayed by that. And even though she understood they were trying to protect her, she experienced, again, a kind of social death. You know, if you're not kept in that fabric of kinship, then you're out of it. So she, you know, says these dark periods were hard. And they diminished as the phone calls became more affordable. So it got better. And I want to contrast that with the case of Andrea. Andrea is a recent migrant. He came over as an international student. And he has quite a different experience. He actually complains about how much his parents want him to be in touch with them because you can, because of the various social media and other ICTs, information and communication technologies available. And like many families, they have a ritual. They have a ritual of staying in touch by Skype once a week. And he says, you have to have a really good reason to skip the Skype call, like you are dead. And he complains, he says his mum sends him little stickers on Viber or WhatsApp, and he's had to train her that one sticker from him is enough. So now we have what's called in the literature a polymedia environment. That means we have, for the first time in history, a choice, a set of options about how we might stay in touch across distance. And as soon as you have a set of options, you have then a set of moral implications. What's really common in Australia is the Skype meal, where it's usually lunchtime in Italy and dinner time in Perth. I don't think you can do that in Sydney. And you have the Skype going and you both enjoy the meal together. These are ways that people stay in touch across distance. There's a care worker from Romania in this story who looks after Nonna Katia, and she knows how to use the Skype, so she helps set up the Skype. How in the past we had these irregular letters and costly phone calls and very rare visits, so the social field was maintained in an asynchronous, intermittent, often formulaic way. People relied on their imagined roles as the good father, the good son, the good daughter. And the narratives were broken and patchy. Whereas today we can, if we put the effort in, and we have the access and the competencies, we can have daily, multiple SMS, regular emails, phone calls, affordable visits. So we have synchronous, real-time, shared co-presence. Some of the surprising finding that for the first time in history, some of us have access to polymedia environments that give us the possibility to stay in touch when and how we want. This choice introduces a moral dimension, I've mentioned that. But what I didn't expect was point number 5, that new technologies have expanded our support networks compared to the past when they were contracted, and that men are playing a bigger role than they did in the past, and that younger generations are playing a role, and that's because of the technology. So the classic scenario in the past was a woman would gather all the information from the network in the homeland and write that letter to a woman, usually in the hostland, who would gather information and send it back. If you were lucky, the men would sign their name at the bottom of the letter. These were usually the blue airmail letter. Remember those? For those of you who are not old enough, they folded up into an envelope, so they were very light. But now, the classic situation is that grandma in Italy gets grandson to set up the Skype call, and the daughter in Australia gets her son to set up the Skype call. So the two cousins are communicating over Skype. Before you know it, they're messaging each other on SMS or Facebook to set up the plan to set up the Skype. And they begin a relationship and enter into a set of reciprocal obligations as part of kinship. And those two cousins in the past might never have had anything to do with each other. So we see an expansion of the network because of new media. And what I'm doing right now is trying to gather evidence in my current research to influence aged care policy, which is very much focused on ageing in place, which makes a lot of sense. We need to have good services and connections locally. To influence that policy to say, don't forget about the distant carers. the family members who are distant but still integral to our emotional lives and our emotional well-being. And for older people, just as they need help with their nutrition and with their exercise and with going to the doctor, they also need help with their digital competencies and digital access and access to the computer. So if we could build in access to the computer, I mean, one story that stands out for me is Mrs. Italiano, who moves into a residential care facility in Perth. She's used to phoning her son, her favourite son, who moved to New York, twice a week. She phones him because he's not very good at keeping in touch, but he does answer the phone and they have a lovely conversation. She moves into residential care and there's no landline in her room. And the care staff are happy to bring her the call, but she can't make it. And relying on her son to make it's really hard. So this relationship easily fades away. So we could build into the care plan of the care worker staff a Skype call. And now the care workers are often from new and emerging communities like the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. They don't share the same language as the old, ageing Southern Europeans. So that Skype call could then facilitate some translation between the care worker and Mrs. Italiano. They could get to know each other better. So you can see ways in which we could include the distant carer more in the care scenario. And we've got some lovely other projects happening about teaching older people to become more familiar and more comfortable with new media. And the whole idea is about recognising the role of the distant carer. So I'll leave you with this interesting need, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the internet at the bottom. And the United Nations about 2 years ago said that the internet should be, access to the internet is a basic human right. They're talking about it in terms of access to information, and our aged care, My Aged Care portal is an online portal, so that is access to information that's essential for health and well-being. But I think we need to think also about access to the internet for our distant carers and our need to be co-present across distance, which is more and more an issue for all of us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you.
I think we've all got stories similar to what Loretta's told us tonight. I know I do. My wife didn't know her father until she was 13. She left him when she was 18 months old, and she arrived in Australia and met him when she was 13 or 14. I can imagine the trauma that causes in families.
My name's Rita, and my grandparents come from Tirano, the Valtellina. And I was interested in what you said about that going home for a visit. And in 1945, my nonna retired from work, the water board for about 38 years here, and they were to go to Italy the following year. My nonna died on the 2nd of November 1945 while her two sons were over in Borneo fighting for king and country. So they never ever went. And I think that was one of the saddest things, that they never ever went home. What did his parents think when he was going all that way to come to Australia, not a word of English? What was in their hearts? And I think that must be lots and lots of grandparents that never ever see their children ever again.
Yeah, so and very emotional when the descendants go. I'm sure you were received and greeted, and the spirit.
I could see the resemblance in my mother's first cousins over there and my two uncles here.
So yes, I think it's interesting how history repeats itself and how we have something to tell about this story. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Migrants. I mean, the only ones I ever come across are young single people in, working in restaurants and bars and coffee shops around the place. Could you enlighten me a little bit on
I
that?
heard the story today of a family who, mum and dad, both professionals with 3 kids, who sort of arrived on COASIT's doorstep and said, well, we're here now, can you help us find a job and accommodation? No real understanding that, actually, no, your qualifications are not recognised here. This family really hadn't done their homework, and that's what precipitated COASIT to offer the Welcome to Australia project, It's really about information, saying to people, do your homework before you leave. So the work that COASIT's doing with the New Wave is very important. I think that is one end of the spectrum. There's another end as well. There's a full spectrum of experiences. But that's really happening in Australia today.
I just wanted to know, you mentioned almost in closing something about programs helping seniors to access the internet or develop IT skills. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more, but maybe
So that's,
the other question.
yeah, thank you for that question. We'll have the next one after you. We don't really collect very good data about age and access to the internet, especially for older people. So I'm trying to gather proper evidence about access. China have a lovely program of love libraries. I'm not sure that's the best translation, but that's how I read it. Where the librarian will set up the Skype call for the older person, because China is also another country in some regions where most of the young people have migrated abroad, many of them to Australia. So that facilitation is also another possibility. But I can't tell you much because they're innovations that are sporadic and patchy. And one of the things I want to do is try to provide some recommendations to government about policy that could provide base level provision in this area.
The young people that you interview, I don't know how many you have interviewed, do they have a concept of, do they think, just as the early migrants did, that they would go back one day? Do they think that now?
In fact, I have a new project that started this semester called Youth Mobilities. So while I don't have an answer that's research-based, I can tell you that it's a question that's central to my work, and I think that we need to find out more about this mobility experience, because I spent 3 years as the director of the Monash Study Abroad Centre in Italy, and a lot of people have pretty lousy experiences study abroad. We don't talk about it, we don't hear about it much, but there needs to be scaffolding and there needs to be information about how a migration or mobility experience can be successful. And I think, you know, what COASIT's doing with the Welcome to Australia is really speaking to that gap. Pina, yeah.
So a few months ago, I went to a forum that was organised. It was a collaboration between FILEF and COASIT, and there was another group which escapes me at the moment, and it was to discuss the issue of the experience of young people working on farms. So the premise was that they're badly treated, that they're having a hard time, they're being usurped. That was the underlying kind of assumption. We were expecting them to complain about the experience, but they had the best time of their life. So, and then there's been a debate in COASIT about what we call this new wave, because it's not the same wave of migration that happened after the Second World War. A lot of people are coming for the experience. They stay a year and then they go to India. It's not like it was for my parents who were desperate to get away from poverty and start a new life. It's different.
So the people who didn't visit were the people who didn't feel they were successful, so they couldn't go home and they had to save face. So, you know, I think there's a full spectrum of experiences and we don't know a lot about it, and hopefully those young people were telling the truth, because I do think there's also evidence of exploitation.
Like the kind, the type, the quality of the communication that takes place through social media is different than live communication, of course. Have you collected any data about how elderly people feel about this?
There was one woman who Skyped her mother for the first time, and the mother said, turn it off, it's too painful, I can't embrace her. So it's very new, isn't it, for some people. Some people bemoan Skype, and that's been the big game changer, because you can see. Because people would say, you know, I have to visit because I can't see where she's living and how, you know, what she looks like. And I don't know if you read in Andrea's quote, he said, my dad doesn't say much. He comes over every Sunday and he has a good look at me on Skype. He says, you okay? I say, yep. And he goes away, and then Mum talks to me. Yeah. And so that seeing has been a game changer in terms of approximating physical co-presence. I think also that people can have really bad relationships that are proximate. It's not necessarily distance. I think we confuse distance as an issue. But you can have really bad relationships and be living in the same house. And you can have really good relationships and be living hundreds of miles away. So I think we need to not see distance as the factor necessarily, because now we have these co-presence opportunities through polymedia. Yeah.
Sorry for my English. I had a story of migration, and because I migrated here in the 90s when internet was really limited, and then later on. So, in fact, I prefer the time when I had less contact with the internet. You can touch the letter, and you know that the letter has been touched by someone.
There was one couple from Pisa who used to print out every single email and put it in a file. So they made the emails into letters. I think that the jury generally argues that it's a picture in time and we need to take a longer view, that maybe the period of, and this is where the literature's up to. Your question is very new.
I'm just curious about the oral history collections, if there is a way of, if there is a database, or, because I know that the generation, my father's generation, he came here in the 50s, and they're all now in their 80s, and I've started doing some oral history recordings with him and his brother. But I know a lot of those stories are very soon going to disappear. So can you identify areas where you think we've got plenty of stories of the sugarcane cutters or of the so-and-so, and what we need are these stories? Is there a way of identifying that?
The Italian historical societies, like the Melbourne Historical Society, has a collection of oral histories. The Batty Library in Perth has a collection of oral histories. They're often not digitised, they're often in the old tape format, so their condition I can't vouch for. I'm sure that COASIT Sydney or the Historical Society here, not oral histories. So I know there's two decent collections, one in Perth and one in Melbourne. There may be others. There was an application a while ago to try and document what we have, but it didn't get funded. It's another area of need, I think. Yeah, but I can certainly put you in touch with people who know about these collections to see what's there.
In the Times, I do remember those phone calls that were with the Bakelite phone waiting for that call from Italy, and the nervous tension rising in the home, and it was often at a strange time at night as well, because you had to contact Italy. And I'm thinking about the situation of my own daughters in their 20s who now have dual citizenship of Italy and Australia, and well, unless you're a politician, dual citizenship is a great thing to have. So they have used that to go, say, to Britain and do their student experience over there. So now I'm in the position of them being in Britain, and I've got foreign students in my home that I am hosting. And I can see all these areas and fields of affection and Skyping, and I've had a little sort of Japanese daughter stay with me for 18 months, and seeing the changes in my own home, and my daughter's Skyping me and seeing all these people in their bedrooms, and how that changes. But the thing of the cousins, and understanding my own Italianità, how that has gone on. For instance, one of my relatives were married, or there was a funeral, and I wasn't able to go, but I asked my daughters to fly, so we sent her money so that she could represent the family over there. And Facebook has been amazing.
Hasn't it?
And I'm thinking back to the previous generation. My parents did not go back because of the great Italian disagreements about various things in the family, and so they left. And it was only after my parents died that I could heal, and I've gone been able to go home and heal. So there's this whole global connection that I'm really fascinated by.
Thank you, Loretta. Thank you very much for taking the time to come so far and talk to us. And I think we could have asked questions all night. There's a lucky door prize tonight, as there usually is. And if everyone would like to stand up and have a look under their seat, and if it doesn't happen to be your seat, perhaps the seat next to you might be lucky. But please have a look and see what's there. Thank you again for coming. You've been a great audience. She's been a great speaker.